Current restrictions on voting access impede the integrity and success of the United States democracy. These restrictions are defended as protections against voter fraud. However, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud altering U.S. elections. In 2014, the Washington Post discovered only 31 credible instances of impersonation fraud from 2000 to 2014 out of more than 1 billion votes cast. HR1 would solidify the expansion of mail-in voting, mandate national automatic voter registration, and 15 days of consecutive early voting for federal regulations, require states to have online options for voter registration, and allow people who have been convicted of felonies and released from prison to vote. While HR1 would not ban voter ID laws, it would allow citizens to provide a sworn written statement to an election official confirming their eligibility to vote. Each of these new provisions would provide opportunities for more Americans to become active in the voting process.
There are concerns that expanding access to the vote would make it easier for malicious interests to manipulate election results, particularly through voter impersonation and ballot stuffing. The concern is that the curtailing of voter ID restrictions in House Resolution 1 would open the floodgates to voter fraud. As elections are run on the local level, it makes sense that one should have to use an ID issued by that state, with the most accurate information available kept by the state to vote there, and to affect the balance of power therein. House Resolution 1 would also work to encourage out-of-state college students to vote in the state in which they attend college. The primary reason that these students should not vote in the state in which they vote in their college's state is that if one does not pay taxes in a state, but instead pays taxes in another state, they should vote in the state in which they pay taxes. Another area in which there is potential for fraud is mail-in voting, which House Resolution 1 would greatly expand. This is particularly worrying because studies have shown that mail-in voting is the largest source of voter fraud in US elections, according to a 2005 American University study.
So my question for the general audience first is, what is it about this moment in time in our democracy that requires such sweeping changes in terms of providing accessibility to the vote? Because there's another perspective to this. Because in the aftermath of the 2020 election, there are 43 state legislators, according to the BBC, that are actually doing the opposite of what this bill is doing. They're actually tightening restrictions on voting.
Same day voter registration, I think, is also really important because it can be difficult for Kenyan students to actually get their ballots from where they're filling them out to the Knox County Board of Elections, and I think it would just make it super easy if that existed.
I think that when it comes to voter fraud, I think one of the things that makes America really great is in our criminal justice system, our assumption of innocence. Obviously, this is done all over the world now, but it was fairly innovative in the English colonial experience, and I think it's a really great thing about our country. And I think that you might as well go ahead and apply that to the same political process, which makes our country great. I'd say it's better to have a few bad actors vote than to have millions of good actors disenfranchised. So I'll stand by that one. As to voting where your taxes are paid, everyone pays federal taxes. So even by that argument, this restriction on where you vote and how you vote shouldn't apply to things like federal or presidential elections.
Political equality is core to what democracy is. And so if you create barriers to voting for people who typically already are not, the most folded into the democratic process, not the most active members of the, democratic process, that I think undermines democracy in key ways.
A significant portion of the country, their confidence in the electoral system has been severely undermined. They think that the last election was stolen. So, does this bill do enough to address their concerns, or can we just push them to the side? Because we see the effects of people who believe these kinds of things at the Capitol riot. So we have to do something, I think, in terms of these people who believe what they do about voter fraud.
This year's version of HR1 includes a concentrated effort to combat the threat of specifically foreign interference in our elections. This is a security issue that political scientists that we all know, Pippa Norris, labels as more of an influential problem in our last 2 elections than the level of voter fraud here at home. In this bill, there are requirements for state secretaries to carry out security risk and vulnerability assessments upon request by election officials, as well as providing more uniform standards of testing for cybersecurity interests. With grant applications, it limits the purchases of voting machines to specifically US manufacturers. I think that's huge. HR1 also sets a nationwide standards for verifying paper ballots. It emphasizes direct voter verification regarding one's personal information before their ballots are actually counted. Critics say that this bill's expansion of voter accessibility presents a threat to election security, but the validity of this claim is kind of challenged by the fact that election fraud, and we're going to touch on this a lot, I feel like, but election fraud is largely disregarded as a critical issue in recent elections. We see this echoed by over 50 courts dismissing President Trump's lawsuits this past year, which alleged voter fraud. But foreign interference is a source of increasing concern amongst election scholars. Researchers at the Brennan Center for Justice, writers for the Harvard Law Review, all designate this as an especially difficult security threat to fight. And it's increasingly complicated with the global accessibility to modern technology. And that is the exact problem that HR1's provisions begin to tackle, while also prioritizing equal voting rights to all Americans. So that was the pro side, mostly focusing on protections against foreign interference in elections. I'm going to now just kind of like give a brief little blurb about why there is opposition, or I guess some suspicion amongst lawmakers in terms of HR1's security approach. Although HR1 certainly provides for greater voter access, with that comes the concern that security is not being prioritized in this bill. And this is especially problematic when our last election was considered to be fraudulent by many Americans. And although these claims are not completely supported with that much evidence, this bill certainly doesn't do much, at least to ease suspicion in a hyperpolarized political climate.
So the main issue with voter ID laws is that we do not have federally mandated IDs in this country. There are countries that do that, and I believe that those IDs are also used in elections, mostly in Europe, in countries in Europe that have mandatory mandatory national IDs. And it has long been shown that there are certain groups in the U.S., particularly people of color and minorities, who are less likely to have IDs, particularly like driver's licenses or concealed carry permits, things that are often issued by the states to prove one's identity. Also, a lot of states don't allow certain IDs. For example, in Texas, you can vote with your concealed carry permit, but you can't vote with your student ID from the University of Texas. And it's pretty clear that like there are certain groups who are more likely to have IDs, and a lot of those groups tend to be more Republican leaning, and often in Republican states, states controlled by Republicans, they will argue to have these strong voter ID laws for the purposes of election security. But also they're also aware that groups that are more likely to have IDs also tend to vote more Republican.
I think the main thing that sows distrust about election results and whatnot is what politicians say, and if they imply that elections are fraudulent. And you saw that a lot with Trump's election claims this past year. Whereas there is like empirical evidence that a lot of these voter registration laws or voter ID laws actually harm minorities.
Of course, political elites have kind of hyped up almost the threat of or the importance of voter ID, but at the same time, it's clearly something that a lot of Americans just think should be a thing in elections. And this is problematic when there are a lot of Americans who don't have voter ID. I think I was looking at the ACLU today, 11% of US citizens don't have government issued photo IDs.
And in section 2411 of HR1, it requires every state to set up a nonpartisan independent commission to rectify the problem of gerrymandering.
At present, as I'm sure many of you know, state legislatures are charged with the duty of drawing the boundaries of the congressional seats and the seats within the state legislature within their state. State legislatures are composed of elected politicians that are aligned with a party, and their decisions on what constitutes effective representation have political consequences. Political science scholar David Schultz argues that this assignment is a conflict of interest, one that has negative consequences for the quality of actual representation and the perceived legitimacy of elections. When races are not competitive, elected officials need not work hard to win over more voters, decreasing the responsiveness of government and the efficacy of representation. A neutral commission could more effectively balance all those criteria without a stake in the political outcomes. Such a reform would increase confidence in the legitimacy of our elections and make our government more representative of the interest of those people that the bodies are intended to represent. While no system for aggregating a state or national interest is perfect, the reform would improve the accuracy of representation and engagement in the democratic process, and significantly improve the quality of our democracy.
Some critics of the bill argue that single-member districts are not a long-term solution to the problem of gerrymandering and advocate that Congress should begin making a shift to a proportional representation system with multi-member districts, which would allow for more diversity in the electoral process.
My question for you is, what are the top priorities, do you think, for these independent commissioners when they're looking at forming these districts? And then secondly, another question I just thought of. But the second question is, what ripple effects would this reform have in our democracy? And then third, going off of what Rose was talking about, does this bill go far enough? What else should be done to improve the quality of our democracies?
So there's not really a perfect way of getting rid of gerrymandering, just based on the geography of where people live. If we really want to make seats proportional to how people vote, then we could use something like nationwide proportional representation, which would be revolutionary, really, for allocating congressional seats, but comes with its own host of problems.
You can't get rid of sort of disproportionality in majoritarian electoral systems entirely, but I think you definitely can amend the system such that you don't get the kind of disproportional results that we see, for example, in Wisconsin, right, where Democrats can win a majority and have like a majority of the popular vote in the state legislature, and it being a super minority of seats.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good sort of comes into this. Like, you might inevitably have districts that aren't representative of all the people, but at least if Republicans and Democrats have to agree on the districting maps, then you won't have expressly strategically built districts.
Sections 4100 through 4211 contain the Disclose Act, which stipulates that any campaign donation that exceeds $10,000 be disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. There is also the Stand By Every Ad Act, which is section 4302, which requires political organizations to disclose their donors in their advertisements. Section 5111 creates a federal funding system for elections that matches small dollar contributions, which are under $200, by 600%.
Before an election can be fair, citizens should have access to high quality information about the choices on their ballot. In today's world, and in this country, informing voters costs a lot. A 2018 Washington Post article reported that experts recommend the most credible campaigns for Congress will cost from about $500,000 to $2 million. And the average cost for a House race in 2016 was $1.2 million. one of the things we need to know as background when we're talking about campaign finance in general is the Citizens United versus FEC decision in 2010. This is a Supreme Court decision that was an interpretation of corporate spending on elections as free speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment.
According to those who support the decision in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, concerns about the decision have been overblown. One of the key concerns that the incumbency advantage of members of Congress would be almost insurmountable has proven to not really be an issue, as the number of freshman members of Congress has actually increased since Citizens United was decided in 2010. Indeed, Washington insider and big business figures are not guaranteed to win office, as Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney both lost their bids for the presidency.
Is privacy an important aspect of the First Amendment, I guess, is the first question in relation to the Disclose Act. And how do we reconcile this with our desire to make elections more transparent?
I think increasing small dollar donations and the opportunity for more people to have a larger impact on politics with less money is a good thing. But I do think Harry's right to point to this arms race of private donations. And it may well be that if you increase small dollar donations, all you do is drive more large donor private donations. And so without a cap, it's just going to negate any relative impact it could have. So
I think it'll be an interesting test as to whether you can restore voting confidence using a national kind of Band-Aid, versus a, kind of state grown, because what's interesting is Ohio, like in the past couple of years, I know they've tried doing like gerrymandering reform. And I think, Ohio voters passed that. So I think going from the 2020 census, they'll be using that information with a citizen, like an independent review board. So it'll, I don't know if it'll pass or not, but it's interesting to look at like national versus more state level kind of tools in that sense.